Okay, Brent back here for the second mini lecture of the module 3, and this part on kind of the local, more in the local food context. So we've so far kind of told a story about surprising levels of food insecurity in Canada, how they are clustered geographically, especially in the northern province, northern territories. What are the household characteristics, things like being a single parent, being a renter, which are associated, being not having university education, being associated with food insecurity, and then kind of bore down in the last mini lecture on the state of food insecurity on the University of Alberta campus. So now I want to think about, so why do we have this in a situation like in Canada, which we think of as a relatively prosperous nation? Why do we have this lingering food insecurity problem? I'm going to share my slides again. Okay. So part of it is the kind of the nature of our government and the nature of the food challenge. Okay. So we have a federal government. So to think about what a federal government is, important to think of two different types of governments that countries have, sovereign countries have around the world. About half or so of countries have unitary governments, and about half have federal governments. Unitary governments are those that have a national constitution that defines all governance responsibilities to a national government, and then that national government may delegate some of its responsibilities to lower levels of government. So to levels of government which are closer to people, like we have in Canada, would be the state situation of municipal governments, which have been delegated some responsibilities from provincial governments. Federal governments are different than unitary governments in that the Constitution directly gives specific government responsibilities to the federal government and other specific responsibilities to provincial or state governments. Both Canada and the US, for example, have federal governments. So in Canada, we have a constitution which defines responsibilities of our national government. The constitution, same constitution, defines responsibilities of provincial government. It turns out that in Canada and to a bit lesser extent in the US, food and agriculture systems and those related to food and agriculture like water and environment are shared responsibilities of federal, provincial, territorial, and Aboriginal governments as defined by our Constitution, or as not defined by our Constitution. If the Constitution is silent on it, then this sharing responsibility may kind of get worked out over time. So that's part of the challenge, is that we have food and agriculture and environment as these shared responsibilities, which means sometimes everyone's responsibility ends up being no one's responsibility. So how should you sort out responsibilities when you have that situation? The European Union, which is governed by an agreement among all of the member states, tries to approach that through the principle of subsidiarity. The principle of subsidiarity is that responsibility for whatever type of governance should be held or have the responsibility of the lower level subunit of the order. So political order would be what's municipal, provincial, or national. What's the subunit of that order that can handle that responsibility best? And you should give it to the lower level unless it can be shown that a higher level unit would ensure higher effectiveness or efficiency. So the default should be that things are handled at the local level, and only when there's a strong case for it to be made should they be made at, say, the provincial level or the national level. That's the principle of subsidiarity. It's interesting to think about that relative to fairness. if we thought about the Rawlsian notion of fairness, where we would say that according to the difference principle, the differences are okay as long as the worst off entity improves their situation, then you think about, well, who is the worst off entity within an area? If you devolve all responsibility to local levels, then they're constrained about their ability to think about who's the worst off within their area. And each municipality would do that independently, or each unit, subunit government do that independently, not seeing, well, who is the worst off unit across the larger area? So say, who is the worst off municipality within Canada, within Alberta, or who's the worst off province or territory within Canada, right? So if you devolve it right to the local level, then you fail to have opportunities to do kind of reallocation of resources across bigger scales. It is interesting when you think about this notion of allocating to local level relative to what Collier has taught us about reciprocity, that we feel this strong bounds of relationship with our families and our communities and our nations. If our communities are that important to us, perhaps subsidiarity is very good, because then we place responsibility at the level at which people feel responsible. People feel responsible for each other at a lower level of unit, so perhaps that's where that responsibility for that should be. So we've got these things which are in a way kind of rubbing at each other in different ways about implementing subsidiarity relative to, say, food insecurity. Are we worried just about people within, say, our city of Edmonton? Are we worried about the people who are in Nunavut? And that kind of depends what we think of as what's the best way to kind of allocate these responsibilities. So that's part of the story about this policy context is this federal nature of our government and the tensions between kind of the benefits of lower level action versus the efficiency or effectiveness and the fairness that we get by fairness that we can implement if we approach the problem at different scales as a policy problem. A second take at this is given by this article by McIntyre that I put on the reading list. And the third slide has the McIntyre reference. So they're looking at food insecurity and saying, why is food insecurity existing in Canada despite recognition over, say, a 50-year period that this is still a problem and a big problem? Recognizing that there's general agreement that food insecurity is both a health problem and a social problem in our country, despite the fact that we have a charitable sector that's supporting things like food banks, and there's quite robust. We saw the numbers, about 4,000 food banks across Canada. There's a general awareness of the problem. So these are all kind of features of an intractable problem, is that you've got a problem, and usually you think of, if it's intractable, it means something is holding that back. So that might be because different people are aligned very clearly to the problem or not. Some people would be aligned to, this is a problem. Other people saying, well, this is not a problem, or this is a completely different problem. You're looking at it in completely the wrong way, right? So what is the conflict which has led to gridlock in Canada? And what McIntyre do is look at the nature of legislative and parliamentary debate in Canada and in 3 of the provinces, to think about how does that come out? How does it come out as an intractable conflict? So they use content analysis of these Hansard records. So these are record of parliamentary debates or legislative debates at the provincial level. They studied all of the debates for over a 17-year period that had something to do with this issue of household food insecurity in Canada or in the province. What they found was then the legislators from different political parties. So primarily in Canada, we've got the three main parties, and the Green being a small fourth party, but legislators from the NDP, the Liberal, who are seen as, NDP is seen as relatively a party which is more in favor of government intervention, the Liberals who are seen as sort of centrist, and the Conservatives who are seen as favor of being less government intervention in people's lives. That these legislators tend to frame the problems differently. Some of them frame this as beyond the scope of government. So say at the Canadian level to say, well, that's not our job to look at, to be responsible for household food insecurity in Nunavut or somewhere else. That's someone else's job or not a government job at all. Or on the other hand, people see it as tremendous evidence of government failure. So it can be, that's a first kind of take of kind of having a cleavage in this debate, which making it more intractable. Therefore, food banks, the way that the same arguments go, food banks are seen as an indicator of government failure, or on the more conservative end, as seen as a noble act of charity. So this is the analysis that they did, is looking at the metaphors and symbols that the different groups are using to make their case. And then the bottom line is that, I'll take that slide out in a minute. The bottom line is that legislators from the different political parties co-construct, so together they're creating this narrative that household food insecurity is intractable, right? And so in a sense, all three of these approaches and political parties are responsible. The legislators from the potentially conservative traditions, like the Conservative Party, tend to dislike big government and emphasize failure of financial management. So they would blame the problem on lower levels of government or their predecessors at the Fed, if they're in power, to say that this is an evidence of you guys not doing a good job. The socially progressive parties argue that the government should protect its constituents and has that responsibility, and that failure to protect constituents is a failure of government. And the centrist parties would more emphasize pragmatic action to be taken. So the bottom line is that every proposal that they were able to study over this 17-year period was seen by one group or another as either too little relative to the problem, too reckless in using public funds, or too ill-conceived, not having thought through the best way to implement this, because all of the solutions didn't meet ideal terms. And so this focus on getting the ideal from the left or from the right or from the center was sort of leading to this intractability of the problem. So part of our legislative process in Canada. Okay, I'm going to end there and stop sharing and end this mini lecture.